17 scouts entered the Appalachian Mountains in 1883. Only 9 came out unharmed. Real quick, before we start. Where are you listening from right now? City, country, time of night? Leave it in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if you're new here, and this is your first story with us, subscribe. New stories go up regularly, and you don't want to find us and then lose us. Okay. November 1883, Harlan County, Kentucky. 17 boys walked into these mountains. Only 9 walked out. The frost came early to Harlan County that year. By the last week of October 1883, the ridgelines above the Cumberland River had already gone white, and the old-timers who sat outside Mercer's General Store on Saturday mornings were saying the same thing they always said when the cold moved in fast and mean. It's going to be a hard winter. They said it the way men say things they've said 100 times before, without drama, without fear. Because hard winters in eastern Kentucky were not events to be dreaded so much as facts to be absorbed. Like the coal dust that settled on every surface, on every windowsill and porch rail and open Bible in every home in the valley. Like the silence of the mountains themselves, which pressed down on the small towns below with a weight that newcomers always found unsettling and that locals had long since stopped noticing. Reverend Elias Drummond noticed it. He had always noticed it. He was not a man given to poetry or to the kind of spiritual romanticism that some ministers cultivated as part of their public character. He was practical, methodical, and precise, a man who kept his firewood stacked by length, his correspondence answered within 3 days, and his boots resoled before the leather gave out rather than after. But the mountains were the one place where Drummond allowed himself something close to reverence that had nothing to do with scripture. He had walked these ridges since he was a boy. He had buried his father's ashes in a hollow near the top of Grey Wing Mountain, in a place no other living person knew about. And he understood the Appalachians the way a man understands the face of someone he has loved for a very long time. Not perfectly, not completely, but with an intimacy that goes beyond words and deeper than reason. Which is why, on the morning of November 3rd, 1883, when he stood at the edge of the Harlan Town Square and watched 17 young men load their packs onto 2 rented mules, Reverend Elias Drummond did something that no one who knew him would have expected. He hesitated. It lasted only a moment, a pause so brief that none of the boys noticed it, and that Thomas Vane, his most trusted aide, would not remember until years later, turning it over in his mind like a stone pulled from a riverbed, trying to understand what the man had seen or felt in that fraction of a second. Drummond stood with his right hand resting on the gatepost at the edge of the square, his breath fogging in the cold morning air, his eyes moving slowly across the assembled group with the deliberate attention of a man counting something he expects to find short. His lips did not move. His expression did not change. He simply stood there for one long, still moment, looking at the 17 boys in front of him as if he were trying to memorize each face. Then the moment passed. He lifted his hand from the post, adjusted the strap of his own pack across his shoulder, and walked toward the group with his long, even stride. "All right," he said. "Let's move." And they did, and the mountains opened up before them. The Harlan County Wilderness Scouts had been Drummond's project since 1871. 12 years of weekend excursions, summer camps, and seasonal hunts that had taken boys from the coal towns of eastern Kentucky and given them, for a few days at a time, something the valley couldn't offer. Open sky, hard ground underfoot, and the quiet confidence that comes from learning how to move through difficult terrain without losing yourself. The program was informal by any institutional standard. There were no uniforms, no dues, no official affiliation with any regional or national body. Drummond recruited participants through his church and through word of mouth, and his only requirements for membership were willingness, reasonable physical fitness, and a signed letter of permission from a parent or guardian. The scouts ranged in age from 14 to 19, came from mining families almost exclusively, and were in most cases boys who had never been more than 20 miles from the town where they were born. For many of them, the Drummond expeditions were the defining experiences of their adolescence. The stories they would tell to their own children decades later, leaning back in their chairs with the particular pride of men who had done something hard and survived it. The group that assembled on November 3rd was the largest Drummond had ever taken into the field. 17 boys, a number that had given him mild pause when finalizing the roster, since he preferred groups of 12 or fewer for manageability. But the interest that fall had been exceptional, and Drummond had a policy which he held to with the quiet stubbornness of a man who understood exactly why he had made it, of never turning away a boy who genuinely wanted to come. The oldest member of the troop was August Finch, 19 years old, broad-shouldered and already carrying the particular solemnity of a young man who has done hard physical labor and found that it changes the way he looks at things. Finch had spent the previous summer at a logging camp in Mingo County, West Virginia, and had returned to Harlan in September with calloused hands, a new economy of words, and an unhurried quality that the younger boys found both impressive and slightly unnerving. He was not unfriendly. He simply did not spend energy on anything he deemed unnecessary, talk, complaint, or expression of any emotion that didn't serve an immediate purpose. He carried the heavier of the 2 packs assigned to the scouts that day and did not mention it. Beside him walked Thomas Vane, 17, with his notebook already open and his pencil moving. Vane was Drummond's aide, a role that had evolved naturally over 2 years of expeditions and that now carried genuine responsibilities, maintaining the daily log, managing the supply inventory, and serving as the Reverend's primary point of communication with the troop when Drummond was busy at the head of the column. He was serious-minded and methodical in ways that mirrored Drummond's own temperament, and the two of them had developed, over their time together, the kind of wordless coordination that usually takes decades to build between people. Vane always knew what Drummond needed before it was asked. Drummond always knew when Vane was troubled before anything was said. Between them, they ran the expeditions with the smooth efficiency of a machine that had been calibrated over time and now simply worked. Caleb Rourke, 16, was the son of the county surveyor and had inherited his father's spatial intelligence without inheriting his father's patience. He was the fastest walker in the group and had a habit of ranging 30 or 40 feet ahead of the column before pulling himself back in line, as if he were perpetually being called home from somewhere more interesting. He had been on 3 previous Drummond expeditions and was widely regarded by the other scouts as the best woodsman among them, a reputation he accepted with a casualness that was either genuine humility or a very convincing performance of it. He knew the difference between white oak and red oak by the texture of bark alone. He could judge the depth of a creek crossing by reading the surface current. And he had an almost proprietary relationship with the trails of eastern Kentucky, the kind of intimacy that makes a person walk through wild places with their shoulders relaxed and their chin up, as though the forest is somewhere they have always lived and to which they are simply returning. Moses Dritt, 15, was the quiet one. He spoke less than anyone in the group, possibly less than anyone Drummond had ever encountered in 12 years of working with young men, but he tracked animal signs with an accuracy that older hunters twice his age found remarkable and occasionally found embarrassing. He could read a trail the way Vane read a page, quickly, with full comprehension, extracting meaning from details that were simply invisible to others. A depression in the leaf litter that would have meant nothing to every other scout in the column meant a doe moving eastward sometime in the last 4 hours to Moses Dritt. A broken twig at hip height meant a black bear. A particular pattern of disturbed ground near a creek crossing meant something had been dragged. He didn't explain how he knew these things. He pointed, and he was correct. And after the first 2 expeditions, Drummond had simply adopted the practice of watching where Moses pointed and treating it as a form of intelligence gathering. And then there was Jerome Aldis, 16, the boy who would become the first to disappear. He was not particularly remarkable in any way that would have made him stand out in memory, which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about him. And it is said here not as cruelty, but as the kind of plain truth that matters when trying to understand what happened. He was of medium height and medium build, with brown hair that sat untidily across his forehead and a tendency to laugh at things a half-second after everyone else, as if he needed just a fraction more time to process the world. He was liked well enough by the other scouts. He was not a natural woodsman, and he knew it, but he made up for it in cheerfulness and in a willingness to do the unglamorous tasks, collecting firewood, washing the cooking pot, standing an extra watch shift when someone else was too exhausted. He had signed up for the expedition because his cousin Perry had convinced him to, and because the idea of 3 weeks in the mountains had seemed, from the warm inside of a coal town autumn, like something worth doing. He had a younger sister named Pearl, who had stood at the edge of the square that morning and waved at him with both arms until the column disappeared around the bend in the road. Jerome had turned and looked back at her and waved with one arm, grinning. Thomas Vane had seen it and written it down that evening without knowing why. Just that image, Pearl's two-armed wave and Jerome's grin, recorded in his small, precise handwriting in the margin of the day's log. He would understand later why his hand had moved to write it down. He would understand a great many things later that he could not understand yet. The remaining 12 scouts are named in Drummond's official roster, submitted to the Harlan County Clerk's office in October of 1883 as part of the expedition's documented itinerary. Horace Birch, Samuel Cray, Levi Tatum, Nathaniel Ford, Owen Marsh, Daniel Priest, Gideon Waller, Fletcher Kane, Amos Lott, Roy Dempsey, Curtis Vane, Thomas's younger brother, 14 years old and on his first expedition, who had begged for 3 months to be included, and whose presence Thomas regarded with the particular mixture of protectiveness and irritation that older brothers understand instinctively. And Perry Aldis, Jerome's cousin, who had been the one to convince him to sign up, and who would carry that fact quietly for the rest of his life, turning it over in the dark hours when sleep refused to come, asking himself the question that has no answer. 17 boys and 1 reverend. The route Drummond had planned followed the eastern fork of the Clover Creek Trail north from Harlan for approximately 8 miles before turning northeast along a series of ridges that ran parallel to the Virginia border. The terrain was demanding, but not dangerous. Long climbs through second-growth forest, several creek crossings that would require care given the early cold, and one exposed ridgeline stretch of about a mile where the wind could cut hard from the northwest. Drummond had walked the route 4 times previously, the last time in the autumn of 1878. He knew every difficult section, every natural resting point, every place where the trail narrowed and required single-file movement, and every place where it opened up onto the kind of broad, leaf-covered flats where a group of tired boys could stop and breathe and feel glad to be alive. The first day went well. The column moved in good order through the early miles, the boys finding their rhythm as the town fell away behind them, and the forest closed in on either side of the trail. The air was cold but not brutal, temperatures in the low 30s, with thin cloud cover pressing the light flat and grey across the ridges. There was something about the first hours of a wilderness march that Drummond had observed over many expeditions and never fully been able to explain. The talking always stopped within the first mile. Not because anyone asked for silence, not because the terrain demanded it, simply because the forest imposed a kind of seriousness on the boys that they could not have imposed on themselves. The jokes and the jostling that had characterized the assembly in the square gave way, naturally and without ceremony, to the rhythm of boots on trail and the sound of breath and the peripheral awareness of trees. By early afternoon they had covered 7 miles, and Drummond called a halt at a wide, flat section of trail where a spring-fed seep created a pool of clean water beside a large chestnut log. The boys dropped their packs and sat. Some ate, some stretched. Moses Drit walked a slow circle around the edges of the clearing, reading the ground with his eyes down, and eventually crouched near the far tree line and studied something for a long moment before standing and rejoining the group without comment. "Well?" Caleb Rourke asked him. Moses looked at the trees to the northeast, in the direction of the trail ahead. "Deer," he said. "Old sign. Maybe 3 days." Caleb nodded. "Good. We're hunting tomorrow." Moses looked at the trees for another moment, and then he looked at the ground again, and something in the quality of his stillness made Thomas Vane, who was watching from across the clearing, stop writing and look up. But Moses said nothing more, and the moment passed, and Vane put it down to the strange atmospheric quality of the day, that flat grey light, that particular silence, and went back to his log. They made camp that evening 12 miles from Harlan, in a wide hollow where 2 ridges met, and the wind was blocked from 3 sides. Drummond supervised the construction of the overnight shelter with his characteristic precision: fire placement, fuel storage, bedroll arrangement. And by the time the darkness settled fully into the hollow and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees, the troop was fed, sheltered, and in reasonable spirits. The fire threw orange light against the tree trunks and the boys' faces, and for a time there was talk and even some laughter, and the mountain felt, in that moment, like the place it had always been. Large and cold and old, but not hostile. Simply indifferent, in the way that all truly old things are indifferent to the small, warm creatures that move through them. Drummond wrote in his journal that night, "Good progress. The boys are in fine form. Weather holding. Moses found deer sign near the afternoon halt. Tomorrow we will cross the Greywing Saddle and make the descent to Cold Pines by evening. All is well." Thomas Vane wrote something different in his own log. Not contradictory. Factually, the day had been everything Drummond described. But Vane, who had a journalist's instinct for detail even at 17, recorded something at the end of his entry that he had not mentioned to Drummond or to any of the other boys. He recorded that at some point during the evening, while the fire was burning low and most of the troop had already settled into their bedrolls, he had looked out beyond the edge of the firelight into the darkness of the hollow and seen, or believed he had seen, something at the tree line. Not a shape. Not an animal, simply the sense of something at the boundary of the visible world, a presence at the margin where the firelight ended and the darkness of the forest began. It had lasted only a moment, and he had told himself immediately and firmly that it was a deer, or the shadow of a branch moving in an air current, or the particular trick that firelight plays on eyes that are tired from a long day of walking. He had told himself this, and he had believed it, and he had gone to sleep, but he had written it down, because Thomas Vane had learned, in 2 years of expeditions with Reverend Drummond, that the things worth recording were not always the things that seemed important at the time. The second day brought harder terrain. The ascent to the Greywing Saddle was steep and long, nearly 4 miles of continuous climbing through dense timber, with the trail switching back and forth across the face of the ridge in long diagonals that tested the legs and the patience of the younger scouts. The cold had deepened overnight, and the ground was harder underfoot, the leaf litter frozen at the surface so that each step broke through a thin crust of ice with a sound like paper tearing. The sky remained overcast, and the light stayed flat and grey and directionless, the kind of November light that makes it difficult to judge either time or distance. Drummond moved the column steadily. He set a pace that was demanding but sustainable, calling brief halts every 90 minutes to allow rest and water, and moving among the boys during these stops with the quiet attentiveness of a man who is constantly assessing and adjusting without making a show of it. He talked to each scout individually during the rest stops, Nothing consequential, just the small exchange of a few sentences that said, "I see you, I know you're here, you're doing well." It was one of the things that made him effective with young people. He understood that what most of them needed, more than instruction or discipline, was simply the regular confirmation that someone was paying attention. They crested the Grey Wing saddle at early afternoon, and Drummond gave the troop 20 minutes to rest and take in what was, on a clear day, one of the finest views in that part of Kentucky. Today, there was no view, only cloud and the close grey air and the sound of wind along the exposed ridge. But the boys sat on the rocks at the summit and ate and talked, and the mood was good. August Finch sat apart from the others, as he tended to do, eating methodically and looking out at the grey nothing where the view should have been. Curtis Vane, 14 and on his first expedition, was sitting next to his brother Thomas and asking questions in a low, continuous stream that Thomas answered with the practiced patience of a person who has been answering the same kind of questions for his entire life. Perry Aldis and Jerome sat together against a large outcrop of limestone, sharing a piece of dried beef, and talking about something that made Jerome laugh a full second after Perry, which was how Jerome always laughed. It was the last time Thomas Vane would see Jerome Aldis laugh. He did not know this then. He would know it for the rest of his life. The descent from the saddle took the rest of the afternoon, winding down through old-growth timber, chestnut and oak and tulip poplar of an age and size that had become increasingly rare in the valley. And the quality of the forest changed as they dropped lower, becoming denser and darker and quieter in a way that was distinct from the comparative openness of the ridge. Down here, among the old trees, the light came in filtered and reduced, and the sounds of the mountain, wind, the distant percussion of a woodpecker, the occasional creak of a large branch, seemed to originate from no particular direction, as if the forest itself was producing them from everywhere at once. Cold Pines Camp sat in a natural clearing approximately 200 yards west of the eastern branch of Ravens Fork Creek, at an elevation of about 2,200 feet. It was a site that Drummond had first used in 1874 and had returned to on 3 subsequent occasions. The clearing was roughly circular, perhaps 60 feet across, bounded on the north and east by a dense stand of white pine, the trees that gave the camp its name, and open to the south and west toward the creek. Previous expeditions had left certain improvements: a ring of stones for the main fire, a rough timber frame for hanging game, and a shallow drainage ditch around the sleeping area that kept the ground from flooding in rain. Drummond had described it, in a letter to a colleague written the previous summer, as the finest natural camp in 20 miles of these mountains, sheltered, watered, and positioned so that you hear the creek through the pines at night, which is the best sound in the world for sleeping. The troop arrived at Cold Pines on the evening of November 5th, just as the last of the grey light was draining out of the sky. They were tired from the descent and quieter than they'd been at any point on the march. That end-of-day quiet that settles over a group of people who have been moving through demanding terrain for hours and whose bodies have simply run out of the energy required for speech. Drummond moved efficiently through the camp setup, assigning tasks and checking their completion with the smooth authority of a man who has done this many times before, and within an hour the fire was built, water was boiling, and the scouts were settling into their bedrolls with the heavy-limbed gratitude of the genuinely exhausted. Drummond wrote in his journal, "Camp in good order. The boys are cheerful. Moses says he found deer tracks near the eastern creek. Tomorrow we hunt." But Thomas Vane, writing in his own log by the light of a small candle, paused for a long time before completing his entry for the day. He sat with his pencil resting against the page and looked at the fire, and then looked at the trees beyond the fire and listened to the creek through the pines. And he wrote, finally, what he had noticed from the moment they entered the clearing. The thing that he had not said to Drummond, the thing he had not said to any of the boys. The thing he had spent the last 2 hours trying to convince himself was nothing. The forest here is silent in a way I have not heard before. Not quiet, silent. There should be owls. There should be the sound of wind in the upper branches, the movement of the pines. There is nothing. Even the creek seems muffled, as if the sound is being absorbed before it reaches us. I asked Caleb if he noticed it. He said yes. I asked Moses. He did not answer. He simply pointed at the tree line to the north and then went to his bedroll without speaking. I do not know what he was pointing at. I looked and saw nothing. The Reverend says it is tiredness. Perhaps it is. But none of us are behaving like tired people. We are behaving like people who are being watched. He closed the notebook, pinched out the candle, and lay down. Around him, 17 people breathed in the silence of cold pines. In the morning, there would be 16. Thomas Vane knew this because he had noticed it on previous expeditions. Jerome would be up before the fire was rekindled, sitting on whatever log or rock was nearest the cold ash of the previous night's burn, his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance with the unfocused look of a person who has not yet fully assembled himself for the day. He never explained why he woke early. He never seemed particularly rested by it. He simply appeared in the pre-dawn grey, sitting there with that absent expression, and then gradually the world would come back to him and he would stand up and begin his morning tasks with the mild cheerfulness that characterized almost everything he did. On the morning of November 8th, the third full day at Cold Pines, the fifth day of the expedition, Jerome was not sitting by the cold ash. Thomas Vane woke at first light, as he always did, and took his quick census of the sleeping forms around him in the same automatic way he took inventory of the supply packs. Not because he expected anything to be missing, but because it was the habit of a careful person and careful people check. He counted again. He sat up in his bedroll and counted a third time, slowly, pointing at each shape in turn with one extended finger. 16. He stood up and moved quietly to the edge of the clearing, scanning the tree line and the path toward the creek. The air was well below freezing, and the pines were dark against a sky that had not yet decided what color it intended to be. The creek was audible from here, or should have been. The sound reached him in the same muffled, absorbed way he had noticed on arrival, as if the water were moving through cloth rather than over stone. He stood at the clearing's edge for a full minute, listening, and then he went to wake Drummond. The Reverend was already awake. He was sitting up in his bedroll with his journal open on his knee, writing in the near dark, with the ease of a man whose hand knows the motion regardless of the light. He looked up when Vane crouched beside him, and something in the boy's face told him immediately that the entry he was writing would need to be revised. "Jerome," Vane said. Simply that. Drummond closed the journal. He stood, put on his coat, and walked to the edge of the clearing without a word. He made the same scan Vane had made: tree line, creek path, the trail they had come in on. Then he turned and counted the sleeping forms himself, with the same deliberate pointing motion Vane had used. He did not do it a third time. "Wake August," he said, "and Caleb," quietly. Within 10 minutes, Drummond, Vane, August Finch, Caleb Rourke, and Moses Dritt, who had been awake, as far as anyone could tell, for some time before he was roused, were assembled at the creek path, while the remaining 12 scouts slept. The dawn had strengthened enough to show the ground, and what Drummond told them was what they already understood. Jerome Aldis was not in the camp. His bedroll was there, his pack was there, his boots, and this was the detail that lodged in Thomas Vane's chest like a splinter. His boots were there, placed neatly beside the bedroll in the way a person places boots when they intend to put them on in the morning. Jerome had left the camp barefoot, in freezing temperatures, before dawn, without his pack, without his boots, and without waking anyone. "Moses," Drummond said. Moses Dritt was already looking at the ground. He moved along the edge of the clearing with his head down and his hands loose at his sides, moving in slow arcs that gradually extended outward from the camp perimeter. The others watched him work. Nobody spoke. The silence of the forest, that particular absorbed silence that had been present since their arrival, seemed heavier in the early light, as if it had gathered weight overnight. Moses stopped at the northern edge of the clearing, near the dense stand of white pines that gave the camp its name. He crouched and studied the ground for a long moment. Then he stood and looked into the trees, and his face, which was normally so composed as to be almost expressionless, showed something that Thomas Vane later described in his journal as the first genuinely frightened expression he had ever seen on Moses Dritt's face. "He went in there," Moses said without turning around. He was pointing into the pines. "Tracks?" Drummond asked. "One set, bare feet, going north." "How recent?" Moses was quiet for a moment. "After midnight, before the temperature dropped again. 2, maybe 3 in the morning." Drummond studied the tree line. The pines were old growth, dense and dark, the lower branches interlocking at about shoulder height, so that the interior of the stand was a long, low tunnel of shadow. No trail entered here. This was not a route anyone in the group had used or surveyed. It was simply the place that Jerome Aldis's bare feet had carried him in the middle of the night while the rest of the troop slept. "All right," Drummond said. "We search, in pairs. Nobody moves more than 50 yards from the clearing without calling back. If you find him, if you find anything, you call out and you wait. You do not pursue alone. Is that understood?" They said it was. They searched for 7 hours. The white pine stand extended northward for approximately 300 yards before giving way to a mixed forest of oak and hemlock that climbed steeply up the lower face of the ridge. The search parties moved through it systematically, calling Jerome's name at regular intervals in voices that started confident and gradually, over the course of the morning, acquired an involuntary quality of hesitation, the slight catch of a person who is beginning to understand that no answer will come. Drummond moved with controlled urgency, directing the pairs, adjusting the search grid, never raising his voice above the tone of quiet authority that the scouts had come to recognize as the register he used when the situation was serious. He was everywhere that morning. At the edge of the pine stand, on the lower ridge, crouching over the rocky ground near the creek where Moses had found and then lost the trail of bare footprints. He did not stop moving. He did not sit down. He did not, as far as Thomas Vane could observe, allow himself to show the boys anything other than the focused competence of a man who believed that the problem in front of him was solvable with the application of enough methodical effort. But Vane saw his hands. Late in the morning, during a brief halt when the search parties regrouped near the creek to exchange information, Vane looked at Drummond's hands and saw that they were trembling. Not from cold. The Reverend was dressed adequately for the temperature, and in any case, the exertion of the morning's movement would have kept him warm. The trembling was something else entirely, and it was small enough and controlled enough that none of the younger boys noticed it. But Thomas Vane noticed it, because Thomas Vane noticed everything, and because he had spent 2 years watching this man's hands, and in 2 years he had never seen them shake. He said nothing. He recorded it that evening in his journal. He would spend decades afterward asking himself whether he should have said something in that moment, whether it would have changed anything, and he never resolved the question to his own satisfaction. The search ended at 3 in the afternoon, when the light began to fail, and Drummond made the decision that every leader in that situation eventually has to make and never feels ready to make. He called the scouts back to camp. He sat them down around a rebuilt fire and told them, with the plain directness that they had learned to trust from him, exactly what the situation was. Jerome Aldis had left the camp before dawn, apparently without boots or pack, and had not been found. They would resume the search in the morning with full daylight. They would remain in pairs at all times, within voice range of the camp. Nobody would move outside those parameters without explicit permission. He did not say what several of them were thinking. He did not say that bare feet on frozen ground in November were not a condition from which a person walked very far. He did not say that 7 hours of searching with 12 experienced sets of eyes had found nothing. No additional tracks, no sign of disturbance, no evidence of any event at all, beyond that single set of shallow, barefoot impressions leading into the northern pine stand and then simply stopping, as if Jerome Aldis had walked to a specific point in the trees and then ceased to exist. He did not say these things, but the boys around the fire that evening were not children, and the sons of coal miners in eastern Kentucky in 1883 were not unfamiliar with the idea that hard things happen to people and that naming them does not change their nature. The silence around the fire that night was different from the silence of the previous evenings. It had a different texture, tighter, more concentrated, the silence of people who are thinking specific thoughts that they have collectively agreed not to voice. Perry Aldis sat with his hands between his knees and his eyes on the fire, and nobody said anything to him because there was nothing to say. He was Jerome's cousin. He had convinced Jerome to come. The arithmetic of that fact was written on his face as clearly as if it had been carved there, and the kindest thing the others could offer him was simply their presence and their silence. Moses Dritt sat apart from the others again, as was his habit, but tonight his position was different. He had placed himself with his back to the fire and his face toward the northern tree line, in the direction of the pine stand. He sat that way for the entire evening, not eating, barely moving, watching the darkness beyond the clearing with the still, absorbed attention of a hunting animal. Thomas Vane watched him from across the fire and tried to determine what Moses was seeing or expecting to see, and could not. When the rest of the troop finally moved to their bedrolls, Vane went to Moses and crouched beside him. "What are you looking at?" he asked. Moses was quiet for a moment. Then, "Nothing is moving out there. It's cold. Animals shelter." "Animals shelter," Moses agreed. "But they don't shelter this completely, even in hard cold. You hear them, a branch, a footfall, something. Since we came here, I have not heard a single animal in these woods at night. Not one, not in 3 days." Vane looked at the tree line. The darkness beyond the firelight was absolute, a solid wall of black that the light could not penetrate, that gave back nothing. "The Reverend thinks Jerome sleepwalked," Vane said. Moses said nothing. "You don't think so?" Moses turned and looked at him for the first time. In the firelight, his face was very calm and very serious, the face of someone who has already processed a difficult fact and arrived at an uncomfortable conclusion. "Thomas," he said, "Jerome's boots were placed neat, side by side, even, like someone who knows where they're going doesn't need them." Vane looked at him. "That doesn't make sense." "No," Moses said, "it doesn't." He turned back to the tree line and said nothing more. And Vane eventually went to his bedroll and lay in the dark with his eyes open and the notebook pressed against his chest, listening to the creak that sounded wrong through the pines and the forest that was silent in a way that forests should never be. In the morning, they resumed the search, and in the afternoon of that second day, Moses Dritt found something at the Eastern Creek bank that changed the nature of everything. He found it while working the creek perimeter alone, a violation of Drummond's pairs rule that Drummond chose not to address, partly because Moses worked best alone, and partly because, as he would later admit to Vane, there was something about Moses Dritt's relationship with the terrain that made the standard precautions feel less applicable. Moses moved through wild places like water moves through rock, finding the natural channels, encountering no unnecessary resistance. And the idea of constraining that movement felt to Drummond like a category error. Moses came back from the creek at mid-afternoon and went directly to Drummond without speaking to any of the other scouts. Drummond followed him back to the creek in silence. Vane, who had been watching from the camp edge, followed at a distance and was close enough to observe what Moses showed the Reverend without being close enough to hear what was said between them. What Moses showed him was this. On the eastern bank of Raven's Fork Creek, approximately 60 yards downstream from the camp, there was a wide, flat shelf of exposed limestone that ran along the bank for perhaps 20 feet before dropping into the water. The limestone was gray and pitted with age, and in the ordinary way of limestone creek banks in Kentucky, it showed the subtle evidence of long use by animals and weather alike. Algae stains, the score marks of waterborne stone, the occasional imprint where a deer had stood to drink. But on this section of bank, the limestone had been marked in a pattern that was not water and not weather, and not any animal that Moses Dritt had ever tracked. The marks were arranged in a rough arc along the innermost edge of the flat, closest to the tree line. They were not deep, shallow impressions in the stone's soft algae surface, already partly degraded by moisture, but they were clearly regular, clearly intentional. Spaced at approximately equal intervals around the arc, each mark roughly the same size and shape, a vertical line intersected by two shorter horizontal lines, like a crude letter, or like a tally, or like nothing that had a name in any reference either of these men carried. There were 17 of them. Drummond stood over the marks for a long time. His breath fogged steadily in the cold air. His hands, Vane observed from his position upstream, were not trembling now. They were absolutely still, pressed flat against his thighs, with the deliberate stillness of a man who is imposing control on his own body by sheer force of will. He said something to Moses. Moses responded. Drummond said something else. Then he crouched and looked at the marks from a lower angle, moving slowly along the arc from one end to the other, and when he reached the far end, he stopped and stayed, crouched for a long moment, before standing up. He turned and saw Thomas Vane standing upstream. The two of them looked at each other across 30 feet of creek bank and cold air, and what passed between them in that look was not communicated in words and was never transcribed in either of their accounts. But Vane wrote this that evening in his journal. The Reverend looked at me from the far end of the bank, and I understood in that moment that he had known something was wrong from the beginning, from the square in Harlan, when he hesitated at the gatepost. Whatever he had felt in that moment, whatever knowledge had moved through him in that fraction of a second before he lifted his hand and said, "Let's move," it had not left him. He had been carrying it for 6 days, waiting for it to resolve itself into something he could name, and now, standing over those marks in the limestone, he could name it. I could see it in his face. I could see the relief that comes, God help us, from finally knowing what you're afraid of. Even when what you're afraid of is terrible. He had a name for it now. He did not share that name with me. I am not certain, even now, that I would have wanted him to. They returned to camp without discussing what they had found at the creek. Drummond gathered the troop and announced, in his level voice, that the search for Jerome would continue the following morning, and that in the meantime he needed everyone to eat, rest, and maintain the camp routines. He gave no information about the limestone marks. He assigned the evening watch duties with the same methodical fairness he always applied to the task. He sat with Perry Aldous for a long time after dinner, talking quietly in a way that the other scouts politely avoided overhearing. That night, Drummond wrote the longest entry in his journal since the expedition's start. It ran to 4 pages in his small, precise hand and covered 3 subjects: a description of the limestone marks and his interpretation of them, which he kept in a deliberately clinical register that drained the observations of the fear they surely contained. A revised assessment of the terrain and conditions at Cold Pines that included, for the first time, the observation that the site felt materially different from his previous visits in ways he could not attribute to season or weather. And a list of contingency decisions. The language of a man working through options before committing to a course of action. The final entry on that page reads, "Primary obligation is the safety of the boys. Secondary obligation is the truth of what has happened here. I do not yet know if these two obligations are compatible. Tomorrow will clarify." Tomorrow would not clarify. Tomorrow would make everything worse. On the morning of November 10th, the 7th day of the expedition, the troop woke to find that 2 more scouts had gone. Horace Birch, 16, and Levi Tatum, 15, had shared a sleeping position on the western side of the fire ring. Both bedrolls were present. Both packs were present. Horace's boots were beside his bedroll, placed neatly. Levi's boots were on his feet, or rather, they were at the end of his bedroll, as if he had fallen asleep with them on, and they had been removed while he slept. This detail, the removed boots, broke something in Perry Aldis that the previous 6 days had been slowly fracturing. He sat on the ground beside Jerome's empty bedroll with both boots in his hands and stared at them with an expression that Thomas Vane could not look at directly and eventually had to turn away from, not because it was ugly, but because it was too precisely the face of a person whose internal architecture is giving way, and witnessing it felt like an intrusion on something private and sacred and devastating. August Finch put his hand on Perry's shoulder. He left it there for a long time without saying anything. This was, in Vane's account, the most significant thing August Finch did during the entire expedition. That silent, steady hand. And Vane wrote it down with the seriousness he gave to all the details that the situation kept handing him. 3 missing boys, boots placed neat, marks in the limestone, a forest that had been silent for 7 days, and a reverend who had hesitated at a gatepost on a cold November morning in Harlan, and then walked into the mountains anyway. Drummond called the full troop together and spoke to them for 20 minutes. He was honest in the way that the situation demanded and restrained in the way that leadership required, and the balance he struck between those 2 imperatives in front of 14 frightened boys on a cold mountain with 3 of their number missing was, by any measure, an act of considerable human courage. He told them that Jerome, Horace, and Levi had not been found. He told them that he was revising the expedition's plan. They would conduct one final morning search, and regardless of outcome, begin the return march to Harlan by early afternoon. He told them that Cold Pines was being abandoned. He did not tell them about the marks on the limestone. He did not tell them what he believed was in the forest. But he told them this, and Thomas Vane recorded it word for word because it was the only moment in 6 days of increasingly frightening events when Drummond's controlled exterior showed what was underneath it. "Boys, I have walked these mountains my whole life. I know them better than I know most people. And I want you to hear me clearly. What is in this forest right now is something I have never encountered before. I do not know its nature, but I know it is here. And I know that the correct response is not investigation. The correct response is to leave. We leave today." Silence around the fire. 14 faces looking at him. It was Curtis Vane, Thomas's 14-year-old brother on his first expedition, who spoke first. "What about Jerome?" he asked. "And Horace and Levi?" Drummond looked at him. He was quiet for a long moment. "We will send a search party back from Harlan," he said. "Better equipped, more men. I will lead it myself." Curtis looked at his brother. Thomas looked at the Reverend. The Reverend looked at the fire. Nobody said what everyone understood, that in the mathematics of the situation, the 9 words Drummond had just spoken, "We will send a search party back from Harlan," meant something that no one in the circle was willing to name out loud. They began the morning search anyway, because the alternative was to sit in camp and wait for whatever had taken 3 of them to come back for more. And movement, even futile movement, was preferable to stillness. They moved in tight pairs, never beyond 30 yards of the clearing, calling names into the trees with the increasingly hollow sound of people who are performing a ritual rather than expecting a result. Moses Dritt did not participate in the search. He stood at the edge of the camp and watched the others move among the trees, and then he turned and walked back to the limestone bank alone. Drummond saw him go and did not call him back. Moses was gone for 40 minutes. When he returned, he went directly to Drummond and spoke quietly into his ear for about 30 seconds. Drummond listened without expression, and then he turned to the camp and said, in his even voice, "Pack everything. We move in 1 hour." He did not tell them what Moses had said. Thomas Vane asked Moses later, on the trail back. Moses walked in silence for a long time before answering. When he did, he looked straight ahead, his eyes on the trail, his voice flat and informational, the way he always spoke about what he read in the ground. "The marks," he said. "When I went back this morning." "Yes?" "There were 14 of them." Vane stopped walking. Moses did not stop. Vane stood on the trail and looked at the back of Moses Dritt's head as the boy moved ahead of him through the cold gray forest. And then he started walking again because the alternative was to stand still in these trees alone. 14 marks where there had been 17. 3 gone, 3 marks gone. He did not write it down immediately. He waited until they had put 4 miles between themselves and Cold Pines, until the white pines were well behind them and the trail had widened and the forest had resumed, gradually, tentatively, something closer to its normal sounds. A wind in the upper branches, a woodpecker in the far distance, small sounds, ordinary sounds, that had been absent for 7 days and that now returned like light, coming back after an eclipse, gradually, incompletely, but returning. Then he stopped and opened his notebook and wrote it down. Every detail, every word Moses had spoken. The count of marks in the limestone, the absent boots, the peculiar silence that had surrounded Cold Pines from the moment they arrived. He wrote for a long time, standing in the middle of the trail while the column moved around him, because the act of writing it down was the only way he had of making it manageable, the only way of taking the raw, unprocessed terror of the last 7 days and converting it into something that resembled sense. Whether it made sense was a question he would spend decades attempting to answer. Behind them, Cold Pines was already doing what it would complete over the course of the next 48 hours. The process that the returning search party would find evidence of, and that would become the detail most frequently cited in the years of subsequent inquiry. The camp was disappearing. The column was 4 miles from Cold Pines when Fletcher Kane stopped walking. It was not a dramatic stop. There was no cry, no stumble, no outward physical event to mark the moment. He simply ceased to move forward, the way water ceases to flow when the channel ahead of it closes. The boy behind him, Samuel Cray, 15, walked into him from behind and grabbed his arm to steady them both, and then looked at Fletcher's face and felt the first cold wave of something that was not an emotion he had a name for yet, but that he would carry in his body for the rest of his life as a physical memory, like scar tissue. Fletcher Kane was looking at the trail ahead, the trail that Drummond had walked 4 times before, the trail that ran northeast along the ridge from Cold Pines back toward the Greywing Saddle, the same trail they had descended 5 days ago with their packs full and their spirits adequate and 17 people in the column. That trail. The one Drummond had mapped in 1878 and described in his expedition notes as straightforward and well marked, with 3 natural waypoints: a large split rock formation at the 2-mile mark, a seasonal spring at 4 miles, and the open ridgeline at 6 miles that preceded the final descent to Harlan. Fletcher Kane was looking at that trail, And something about what he was seeing made him stop walking, and made Samuel Cray's hand tighten on his arm, and made the boys directly behind them slow and stop and cluster, until the entire column had compressed itself into a knot of 14 people standing in the middle of the trail, looking at the same thing. The trail ahead was different, not dramatically different, not impassable, not blocked, not obviously changed in any way that Thomas Vane could articulate cleanly when he wrote about it that evening. But different in the specific, quiet, deeply wrong way that a familiar room is different when something in it has been moved while you weren't looking. The unsettling sensation of a world that has been altered in your absence without your consent. The trail continued ahead. Yes. The trees were the same species, the same approximate age and density. The ground underfoot was the same frozen leaf litter. But the particular arrangement of things, the angle of light between the branches, the way the trail curved to the left at a certain point that Vane remembered as curving right, the absence of a specific rock formation that should have been visible from this point, all of it was subtly, insistently wrong. Caleb Rourke pushed through to the front of the column and stood beside Drummond, who had already stopped and was looking at his hand-drawn map, with the focused attention of someone trying to reconcile what they are seeing with what they have recorded. Caleb said nothing at first. He studied the trail ahead with the proprietary intensity of a boy who had spent his childhood reading these mountains. "This is wrong," Caleb said. "We may have drifted east on the descent," Drummond said, but his voice had the flatness of a man proposing an explanation he doesn't believe. "No," Caleb said. "We didn't drift. I watched the bearing the whole way. We came exactly the way we came in. This is the same trail." He pointed to a specific section of ground 20 feet ahead, where the leaf litter was compressed and darkened in the distinctive way of a frequently used path. "That's the trail. Our trail. But the split rock should be visible from here, and it isn't." Drummond folded the map. He looked at the trail for a long time without speaking. Behind him, 14 boys stood in the compressed quiet of people who have collectively decided not to speak until the person they trust to speak tells them it is time. Moses Dritt moved through the column from the rear and stopped at Drummond's side. He looked at the trail ahead, then looked off to the right, into the dense, mixed forest on the slope above them. He crouched and examined the trail surface, studying the impressions, the texture, the very particular language of disturbed ground that only he could read fluently. And then stood and said one quiet sentence. "Something has been here since we came through." "An animal?" Drummond asked. Moses shook his head. "Not an animal." The column stayed still. The forest around them maintained its partial quiet, better than it had been at Cold Pines, but not right, not normal, still carrying that absorbed quality that swallowed sound before it could fully exist. Somewhere above them on the ridge, a branch cracked with the sharp, dry report of cold weather wood splitting, and every boy in the column flinched simultaneously. A single involuntary wave of movement that passed through the group, like a shudder. Drummond made a decision. He made it quickly and announced it without qualification, the way he had learned, in 12 years of leading young people through difficult terrain, to announce decisions when the situation demanded action over explanation. They would not continue on the current trail. They would climb due south, gaining elevation, until they reached a ridgeline he knew ran parallel to their route and offered an unobstructed bearing back toward Harlan. The climb would add 2 hours to the return and would be hard going through heavy timber, but it was a known route. He had used it once before, in 1876, in an emergency, and he trusted it. He did not explain why he was abandoning the familiar trail for a harder route. He did not need to. The 14 faces looking at him in the cold, filtered light of the November forest had reached a consensus that did not require articulation. Whatever had happened to Jerome Aldous, to Horace Birch, to Levi Tatum, it was connected to this forest, to this section of mountain, to something in these trees that had been present since their arrival, and that was present still. And the correct response to it was not the studied calm of people who believe they understand their environment. The correct response was to move quickly toward the world they knew. They began the southward climb. The first hour was the hardest sustained piece of terrain they had covered on the entire expedition. The slope above the trail was steep and thickly forested, the ground broken with exposed root systems and limestone outcroppings that required constant attention and made anything approaching a steady pace impossible. Drummond moved the column with deliberate patience, choosing each section of the route with care, stopping to assess the terrain ahead before committing the group, managing the speed differential between the faster boys at the front and the slower ones at the rear with a continuous series of quiet adjustments. He was doing what he did best, maintaining order in difficult conditions. And the troop responded with the disciplined compliance of boys who have learned, over the course of a very frightening week, to follow without question. It was during a brief halt at a rocky outcrop, approximately 40 minutes into the climb, that Owen Marsh disappeared. Owen Marsh was 16, the third of the Drummond Scouts, to play what could be called a supporting role in this expedition. Neither the most capable nor the least, a solid and untroubling presence in the column who had never given Drummond any reason for particular concern. He was climbing near the middle of the group, behind Daniel Priest and ahead of Gideon Waller, when Drummond called the halt. The column compressed against the rock face, boys finding footholds and handholds and pausing to breathe in the way of people who have been climbing hard. Thomas Vane was near the front. He heard Drummond call the halt, felt the compression of the column from behind, and turned to count heads with his automatic census habit. He counted 13. He counted again. 13. He pushed back through the column. Pardon me, moving against the grain of the stopped group, counting faces as he went. He reached the end of the column and counted 13 faces and one empty space where Owen Marsh had been between Daniel Priest and Gideon Waller. Gideon Waller was staring at the space. "Where's Owen?" Vane asked. Gideon Waller was 15 years old and had been on 2 previous Drummond expeditions and was, by any account, a steady and reliable boy. He was staring at the empty space in the column with an expression that Thomas Vane had not seen on a living person's face before and did not want to see again. And when he finally spoke, his voice had the flat, pressed quality of a person speaking through a state of shock that has not yet fully resolved into recognizable form. "He was right here," Gideon said. "I was looking at him. He was right here." "Did he step aside, off the trail?" "Thomas." Gideon turned and looked at him, and his face was the face of a boy who has seen something that he does not have language for and is not going to acquire language for quickly. "He was right here, and then he wasn't. I was looking at him." Thomas Vane called for Drummond. The Reverend came back through the column and listened to Gideon Waller's account without interruption. He asked 2 brief questions. Which direction had Owen been facing, and had there been any sound? And Gideon answered, "Facing uphill, and no. No sound. Not a step, not a branch, not a breath. One moment present, the next moment absent. In the space of time it takes to blink." Drummond turned and looked at the forest on either side of the column's position. The slope above them continued into dense timber. The slope below them dropped back toward the trail they had abandoned. In every direction, the forest showed nothing. No movement, no sound, no evidence of any event. The cold air was still. The trees were still. The rocks were still. And Owen Marsh was gone. "Drummond." It was August Finch's voice from the front of the column, low and controlled. "If we stop here, we lose more." The Reverend looked at August for a long moment. August Finch, 19, who had spent a summer at a logging camp and come back changed, who had carried the heavier pack without comment, who had put his hand on Perry Aldis's shoulder without speaking. August Finch, who was looking at him now with the direct, unsentimental eyes of a young man who has processed the arithmetic of the situation and arrived at a conclusion that is terrible but correct. If they stopped, they lost more. "We move," Drummond said. They moved. The next 90 minutes were the most difficult sustained period of Thomas Vane's young life, and he spent them in a focused, almost meditative state that he would later describe as the mind's response to extreme threat. A narrowing of attention to the immediate and the actionable, a suspension of all emotional processing in favor of the pure mechanics of movement and survival. He climbed. He watched the boy in front of him and the boy behind him. He counted heads at every opportunity. He listened to Drummond's voice calling directions from the front of the column, and he translated those directions into his own body's movement. Left, right, up, through, step here, not there. With the robotic efficiency of a person who has outsourced all judgment to a more competent authority and is grateful for the arrangement. He did not look into the trees on either side. He had understood. By this point, that looking at the trees was not useful. Whatever was there did not show itself in the trees. It showed itself in absences, in the space between where someone had been and where they were not anymore, in the subtraction of a known presence from the counted total of the living. It did not announce itself. It did not perform. It simply removed people from the column the way a careful hand removes objects from a table when no one is watching, cleanly, completely, and without disturbing anything around the removed object. Roy Dempsey went during the second hour of the climb. Roy Dempsey was 17, and he was at the rear of the column, which Drummond had positioned himself to manage directly. At the moment Roy disappeared, Drummond was 4 feet in front of him. 4 feet. He turned to help Roy over a difficult route crossing, reached back with one hand to offer a grip, and Roy Dempsey was not there. Drummond stood on the route crossing with his hand extended into empty air and looked at the place where Roy had been, and then looked at the forest on both sides of the trail and said nothing for a moment that Thomas Vane, who witnessed it from further up the column, would describe as the longest moment of his life. Then Drummond lowered his hand and turned and looked up the slope at the 12 remaining boys in the column, and something in his expression was different from anything they had seen on his face before. Not broken, not despairing, but fundamentally altered, the way a landscape is altered by a single significant subtraction. He had been 4 feet away. He had been holding out his hand. "Keep moving," he said. His voice was the same. He had preserved the voice. "Don't stop. Don't look back. Keep moving." They kept moving. Amos Lott was the 5th to go. He went midway through the 3rd hour of the climb, in the middle of the afternoon, when the grey light had thinned further toward the particular quality of a November dusk in progress, and the ridgeline Drummond was navigating toward was finally visible above them as a change in the sky. A lightening, a suggestion of open space beyond the trees. Amos was near the front of the column, behind Caleb Rourke, and he vanished in the same manner as the others. Present, and then not present, without transition and without sound. Caleb turned and saw the empty space and put his hands on his knees and bent forward as if he had been struck in the stomach. He stayed in that position for a count of 5 while the column pressed around him, and then he straightened up and looked at Drummond with the hollow, stripped expression of a person whose understanding of how the world works has been revised fundamentally and without his consent. "Reverend," he said. "What is this?" Drummond looked at him. "I don't know. You said you had a name for it." A pause. "I said I could name what I was afraid of. Those are not the same thing." Caleb looked at the empty space where Amos had been. "How do we stop it?" "We reach the ridge," Drummond said. "We get above the tree line. We get into the open." He looked at all of them, the 12 remaining faces, cold and frightened, and looking at him with the absolute desperate trust of people who have no other option. I believe that what is happening here is specific to this forest, to this elevation, to this particular section of these mountains. I believe it cannot follow us above the tree line. I believe... He stopped. He started again. I have to believe that, and we have to move. Now. They moved. The final push to the ridgeline took another 40 minutes of brutal climbing, and during those 40 minutes, Drummond implemented the only countermeasure he had available to him. He made them touch. He restructured the column so that each scout had one hand on the shoulder of the boy in front of him, and one hand gripping the collar of the boy behind, forming a human chain that moved up the slope in a slow, connected, inelegant progression that sacrificed speed for continuity. You could not vanish from a human chain without the people on either side of you feeling the absence before it completed itself. You could not be removed quietly from a linked sequence of hands and collars, could you? He did not know. He genuinely did not know. He was a Methodist minister and a practical man and a person whose understanding of the world had, over the past 7 days, been subjected to pressures that no prior preparation had equipped him to withstand. And he was making decisions not from knowledge, but from the particular desperate creativity of a person who has exhausted their options and is now improvising from first principles. The chain held for 40 minutes through the last brutal section of slope, through the thinning timber and the increasing cold and the flat grey light that was now fully dusk and no longer pretending otherwise. The chain held. 12 boys and 1 reverend, connected hand to shoulder, collar to grip, moving together up the mountainside toward the open sky above the tree line. They came out of the trees at dusk. The ridgeline was bare limestone, swept by a northwest wind that hit them like a wall and made the younger boys stagger. And it was the most beautiful and welcome thing that Thomas Vane had ever felt. That brutal, indiscriminate, utterly natural cold wind, carrying with it the smell of open sky and distance, and the particular quality of air that exists above the trees, clean and simple, and without the absorbed, swallowed quality of the forest below. Drummond counted them. 12. He counted again. 12. He stood on the ridgeline in the wind and the dusk with his hands at his sides and counted 12 surviving scouts and made a sound that was not a word and not a prayer, or perhaps it was both. And then he turned to the east where the ridge descended toward Harlan, and he began to walk. Nobody spoke. 12 boys and 1 reverend, moving along the exposed ridgeline in the gathering dark, connected now only by proximity and by the shared experience of the forest below them. That forest, which sat in its silence 200 feet beneath their feet, giving back nothing, showing nothing, taking nothing more. For now, Thomas Vane walked in the middle of the column and looked straight ahead and did not open his notebook. He would write this hour down eventually, every detail, every word, every absence. He would write it down because the writing was the only way he knew to make truth out of experience, to impose on the formless terror of the last 3 hours some structure that resembled meaning. But not yet. Not until Harlan. Not until they were all the way out. 5 of them were still in the forest. Jerome, Horace, Levi, Owen, Roy, Amos. 6. He counted again in his head. 6. Not 5. He had miscounted. 6 boys were still in the mountain, and the mountain had not given any indication, in 7 days of taking and taking and taking, that it had any intention of giving anything back. The wind cut across the ridge, and the darkness came down around them, and 12 people walked east toward a town that was, God willing, still exactly where they had left it. Behind them, deep in the trees below the ridgeline, something that had no name in any language these boys spoke, stood in the silence it had made, and waited with the patience of very old things. They came down out of the mountains on the evening of November 11th, 8 days after they had left. And the first person to see them was a woman named Clara Mercer, who was bringing in firewood from the stack behind her husband's store when she looked up and saw 12 figures moving along the road from the northern trailhead. She said later that she knew immediately something was wrong. Not from the number of them, though she had seen 17 leave, but from the way they moved. She had seen men come back from mining accidents. She had seen men come back from floods and from fire and from the particular kind of exhaustion that attaches itself to a person who has been in genuine danger and survived it. She recognized the walk, the slightly mechanical quality of it, the forward lean, the eyes that were fixed at middle distance and not registering the ordinary details of the world, the fences, the lamplight in windows, the smoke from chimneys that ordinarily invite attention. She set down the firewood and went to get her husband. Word moved through Harlan, the way word moves through small towns. Faster than it should be possible, through channels that no one could fully account for afterward, arriving at each household in slightly altered form, but with the essential facts intact. 12 had come back. 5 were missing. The Reverend was with them. Something had happened in the mountains that no one was yet prepared to describe. Drummond brought the column to the square, the same square from which they had departed 8 days earlier, and stopped. The boys stood in the lamplight with their packs still on their backs, not because they had forgotten to remove them, but because none of them had moved to do so, as if the act of setting down the weight would require a kind of mental engagement with a rival that they were not yet capable of. People had gathered from the surrounding streets, parents, siblings, neighbors, and the reunion that followed was not the reunion that anyone had imagined when they had waved the column off on the morning of November 3rd. There was no joy in it, or rather the joy was present only in its most reduced and complicated form. The relief of seeing a specific face immediately qualified by the understanding that not all faces had returned. Pearl Aldis was in the crowd. She was standing near the edge of the square, with both arms wrapped around herself in the cold, looking at the column with the searching, hopeful expression of a girl who is making herself believe, through sheer force of will, that she has simply not yet found the person she is looking for among the returned faces. Thomas Vane saw her from across the square and felt something move through him that was larger and more painful than anything he had experienced in the forest, larger even than the terror of the disappearances, because terror, at least, has a quality of immediacy that focuses the mind and crowds out everything else. Whereas the sight of Pearl Aldis searching the faces of 12 exhausted boys for the face of her brother was a grief that required complete emotional presence and offered nothing in return. He went to her. He did not know what he would say. He walked across the square through the cold lamplight and stood in front of Pearl Aldis. And she looked up at him, and he watched the hope in her face go through its stages. Present, questioning, understanding. And he said the only honest thing available to him, which was that they had looked for Jerome and had not found him, and that a search party would go back. She nodded. She kept her arms wrapped around herself. She said very quietly, "He didn't have his boots." Vane stared at her. "How did you know that?" She looked at him with the steady, sorrowful eyes of a 12-year-old girl who has already understood more about what has happened than most of the adults in the square. "Because that's how it works," she said. And then she turned and walked back toward her family's house without further explanation. And Thomas Vane stood in the square and watched her go and wrote nothing in his notebook, because there are some moments that the act of recording diminishes rather than preserves. Drummond spent the first evening after their return in the home of the county sheriff, Everett Polk, a methodical and deliberate man who had been sheriff of Harlan County for 11 years and who had, in that time, managed mine accidents, floods, feuds, and the particular variety of human catastrophe that attaches itself to remote mountain communities with reliable frequency. He listened to Drummond's account with the focused, non-reactive attention of a professional who has learned that the first account of any event is always incomplete and frequently misleading, and who therefore reserves judgment until the full shape of things has emerged. He asked precise questions. He took notes in his own deliberate hand. He did not at any point express disbelief. Not at the disappearances, not at the altered trail, not at the marks in the limestone, not even at Owen Marsh vanishing from 4 feet in front of a man who was reaching out his hand to help him. When Drummond finished, Sheriff Polk sat for a long moment with his pen resting on his notes. Then he said, "The camp. Cold Pines. You left it standing?" "We left everything. Bedrolls, packs, supplies. We took only what the boys were wearing." "When the missing boys' belongings are still there?" "Yes." Polk wrote something. "I'll organize a party for day after tomorrow. 20 men, minimum, armed." He looked at Drummond. "You'll lead us in?" "Yes," Drummond said without hesitation, which was either the answer of a courageous man or the answer of a man who had made a decision in the forest, on the ridgeline, in the wind, that he was not prepared to revisit. The following day, November 12th, Thomas Vane did 3 things. He transcribed his field notes into a clean account that he titled, with the unsentimental precision that characterized all his writing, "A Record of the Expedition to Cold Pines, November 3rd, 11th, 1883. He visited each of the 11 surviving scouts individually, asking each of them a single question. "What did you see, in your own words, that you have not yet told anyone?" The answers varied in their specifics, but were consistent in their essential character. Each scout had seen or felt something in the forest that defied their available categories of explanation, and each had arrived independently at the same conclusion that Vane himself had reached, that the correct language for what had happened was not the language of accident or weather or animal, but something older, something that did not have a comfortable name in the English of 1883. Gideon Waller, who had been standing directly behind Owen Marsh at the moment of his disappearance, was the most precise. He sat across from Vane at the Waller family's kitchen table and looked at his hands and said, "I was watching him. We were in the chain. My hand was on his shoulder. He was there, solid, warm, a person. And then I felt..." He stopped. He pressed his hands flat on the table. "I felt the space where he had been, like when you reach for something that was on a shelf and find the shelf empty. Your hand knows before your eyes do. My hand knew before my eyes did." "And there was no sound," Vane said. "There was no sound. There was no movement. There was no transition. He was there, and then the space was there, and that was all." Samuel Cray, who had walked into Fletcher Kane from behind at the moment Fletcher stopped on the return trail, contributed a detail that no one else had provided. In the instant before Fletcher stopped, Samuel had experienced a brief, distinct sensation of temperature change, not the ambient cold, which was constant, but a localized, focused cold, moving through the column from the rear toward the front, like something passing through them rather than around them. He had assumed it was wind. In retrospect, he was not sure it was wind. Nathan Ford said simply that he had heard, on 2 separate nights at Cold Pines, a sound from the northern pine stand that he was unable to categorize. Not an animal, not wind, not any mechanical or natural source he could identify. A low, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, but slower than breathing and much larger, as if the source of it were significantly bigger than anything that had a right to be in those trees. He had not mentioned it at the time because he was not certain he had heard it, and because the alternative, that he had heard it and it was real, was not a conclusion he wanted to share with a group of boys sleeping in the same clearing. Fletcher Kane said nothing at all. He sat across from Vane and looked at a point somewhere above Vane's left shoulder and did not speak for a long time, and then he said, "I'm not going back." And Vane said he understood, and closed his notebook and left. The third thing Vane did that day was go to Reverend Drummond's house. He knocked and was admitted and found Drummond in his study, seated at his desk with his personal journal open in front of him and a pen in his hand. The fire was burning and the room was warm, and the ordinary domestic details of it, the bookshelves, the framed biblical text on the wall, the small clock on the mantelpiece, had a quality of unreality after 8 days in the forest. The way familiar things sometimes look when you return to them from a long absence and notice, for the first time, that they have always been arbitrary. "I'm writing the entry I've been postponing," Drummond said, without looking up. "Sit down." Vane sat. He watched the Reverend write for a few minutes in silence and then said, "The entry about the gatepost." Drummond stopped writing. He looked at Vane across the desk. "You remember that?" "I've been remembering it since the 3rd day." Drummond set down his pen. He looked at the fire for a moment and then back at Vane, and what he said next was the most complete account he ever gave of what had passed through him in that moment of hesitation at the square. "I had a dream the night before we left," he said. "I don't generally place weight on dreams. You know my temperament. But this one was specific in a way that dreams rarely are. I was standing at the edge of Cold Pines clearing, in the dark, and I was counting the boys around the fire. I counted 17. Then I counted again. 16. Then 15. Each time I counted there were fewer, and each time the ones who remained were looking at me with..." He paused. He chose his next word with obvious care. "With expectation, as if they were waiting for me to say or do something that would stop what was happening, and I could not identify what that thing was, and the count kept going down." He picked up the pen again, turned it in his fingers, set it down. "When I woke up, I told myself it was anxiety, a leader's anxiety before a difficult expedition. I believed that. When I stood at the gatepost and felt what I felt, that hesitation, that impulse to count them before we'd even begun, I assigned it to the same category. Anxiety, the residue of a dream." "But you didn't believe it," Vane said. "I believed it enough to keep walking," Drummond said. He looked at his journal. "I'm not certain that is the same thing." Vane was quiet for a moment. Then, "The marks in the limestone. You said you had a name for what you were afraid of. What was the name?" A long pause. The clock on the mantelpiece measured it. The fire shifted. Drummond looked at his journal and then at Vane with the direct, assessing gaze of a man deciding how much of a truth to transfer. "There are accounts," he said finally, "in the records of the early settlers of this part of Kentucky, the 1790s, the early 1800s, before the coal, before the towns. Accounts collected by a circuit preacher named Horace Alt, who spent 30 years riding these mountains and kept, in addition to his pastoral records, a separate journal of the things that settlers reported to him that he could not account for within his theology and therefore kept outside it. Separate, quarantined." He paused. "I read Alt's journals when I was a young man. A colleague lent them to me. I didn't take most of it seriously. The accounts were fragmentary. The reporters were often frightened people in a difficult country whose imaginations were shaped by conditions I didn't share. But there were specific accounts of a location, described as a high-elevation clearing near a creek and a dense stand of old pine in the ridge country of eastern Kentucky, where, over a period of approximately 40 years, people who camped overnight reported losses. Not deaths, not injuries, losses. People who were present and then were not. Without explanation, without remains." Vane said nothing. "The accounts described marks left near the water," Drummond continued. "Marks in stone, regular, counted." He looked at Vane steadily. Alt's interpretation was theological, demonic, in the specific doctrinal language of his time. I don't share that interpretation. But his description of the marks matched exactly what Moses showed me at the creek. Another pause. 17 marks, Thomas. When we arrived. Exactly 17. The clock on the mantelpiece continued to measure the silence. "Why didn't you turn the group around?" Vane said. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question. The question he had been carrying since the creek bank, or since the gatepost, depending on which moment you assigned as the beginning of his understanding. Drummond was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was honest in the specific, stripped-back way of a man who has decided that accuracy matters more than self-protection. Because I told myself the connection was coincidental. Because I told myself Alt's accounts were the frightened stories of uneducated people in a hard country. Because I told myself that 17 was a common number, and a clearing near a pine stand was a common terrain feature, and the marks might have been made by anyone, at any time, for any reason. He looked at his journal. Because I had made promises to 17 boys and their families that I was not prepared to break on the basis of a dream and an old preacher's folklore collection. He picked up the pen. Because I was wrong, and I will spend the rest of my life with that. He began writing again, and Vane let him write, and the fire burned. And outside the window of the study, the town of Harlan County moved through its ordinary evening, with the uncomplicated normality of a place that does not yet know what is coming back from the mountains. Because something was coming back from the mountains. The search party departed Harlan at first light on November 13th, 23 men under the authority of Sheriff Polk, with Drummond at the front, and Moses Dritt moving ahead of the column in the manner Drummond had learned to allow, reading the trail the way only he could read it. They were armed with rifles, and with the specific, focused energy of men who are angry about something and have been given a legitimate direction in which to point that anger. They were fathers and brothers and neighbors, and they moved fast, and they did not speak much, which was appropriate because there was nothing to say that the circumstances had not already said. The trail to Cold Pines was wrong again. Drummond noticed it at the same point where the column had deviated on the return march. The same section. The same subtle wrongness of the particular arrangement of things. The same angle of light that did not match the memory. He stopped and looked at the trail ahead, and then at Moses, who had stopped automatically and was looking at the slope to the south, with his head slightly tilted, in the posture Drummond had come to associate with active reading of the terrain. "Same as before?" Drummond asked. Moses nodded, but then he said something he had not said before. "It's different from last time. The wrong is different." "What does that mean?" Moses looked at the trail for another moment. "Last time it was changed, like something had moved it. This time it feels..." He stopped. He started again with the careful word selection of someone translating from a language they don't fully speak. Like something is allowing it, like we're being let through. Sheriff Polk, who was standing behind Drummond and had heard this exchange, said nothing. He readjusted the grip on his rifle and looked at the trail ahead with the non-committal expression of a man who has decided that all available information will be gathered and evaluated before any conclusion is drawn. They continued on the original trail without deviation, and it held, stayed right, stayed familiar, delivered them down through the old-growth timber and into the lower country above Ravens Fork Creek, with the straightforward reliability of a trail doing what trails are supposed to do. Moses moved ahead of the column the whole way, watching the ground, saying nothing. The forest around them was quiet in the way Drummond had learned to classify. Not normal quiet, not the quiet of winter birds sheltering and wind above the canopy and the small constant sounds of living woodland. The other quiet, the absorbed, swallowed quiet that converted every sound to nothing before it could complete itself. The men noticed it. Several of them commented on it to each other in low voices, and the comments had the specific quality of people seeking confirmation that what they are perceiving is real and not internal. The fundamental human need in the face of something genuinely strange to have another person agree that it is strange. They reached the approach to Cold Pines clearing at mid-morning. Moses stopped at the edge of the white pine stand and stood for a long time without moving. The other men stopped behind him in a compressed, attentive silence, reading his body language the way people instinctively read the behavior of the most sensitive creature in a group. Then Moses stepped back, turned, and looked at Drummond with an expression that said something the Reverend had no difficulty interpreting. "It's different," Drummond said. "Not a question." "Go and look," Moses said. Drummond walked through the pine stand into the clearing. The clearing was there. The ring of stones for the fire was there. The timber frame for hanging game was there. The shallow drainage ditch was there. The physical infrastructure of the camp that previous expeditions had built and that the current expedition had used was exactly as it should have been, in exactly the positions it should have occupied, arranged with the perfectly ordinary permanence of objects that have not been touched. The bedrolls were gone. Every one of them. 17 bedrolls. 12 belonging to the surviving scouts. 5 belonging to the missing boys, gone from the positions in which they had been left, as cleanly and completely as if they had never been placed. The packs were gone. The supplies were gone. The cooking equipment, the rope, the spare axes, the hand-drawn map that Drummond had made in 1878 and that he had left folded on top of his own pack, all gone. The ground where the bedrolls had lain was smooth, unmarked, covered with the same layer of frozen leaf litter that covered the rest of the clearing, as if no human weight had ever pressed it down, as if no fire had ever burned in the stone ring. Except that the ring remained, because the ring was stone, and stone persists, and perhaps whatever had taken the rest had not extended its jurisdiction to stone. Drummond stood in the center of the clearing and turned a slow circle and took full inventory of the absence. Then he went to the northern tree line, where Jerome's bare footprints had led into the pines 8 days ago, and crouched and looked at the ground. No impressions. The ground here was as clean and undisturbed as the rest of the clearing. The footprints, which Moses had recorded as clear and legible 4 days earlier, were simply gone. He stood up and walked south toward the creek. The limestone bank was there. The flat shelf of gray, pitted stone along the water's edge was there, stained with algae and patterned with the marks of weather and water and long use. Drummond crouched at the innermost edge of the shelf and looked at the arc where the marks had been. The stone was clean, not worn smooth over time. That would show a different surface, a different texture. Clean, as if the marks had been removed deliberately, with care, leaving the surrounding algae and staining untouched. The arc itself was still faintly visible as a structural feature of the stone's edge, the curve, the relative positions where each mark had been. But the marks themselves were gone. All of them. Drummond crouched over the clean stone for a long time. Behind him, the search party had entered the clearing and was moving through it with the careful, methodical energy of men who have come to find something and are confronting, with increasing discomfort, the possibility that what they have come to find is an absence rather than a presence. Sheriff Polk moved among them, directing the search with his customary precision, cataloging the missing items in his notes with the particular dedication of a man who believes that sufficient documentation of a thing will eventually yield its explanation. He found no missing boys. He found no remains, no blood, no sign of struggle, no evidence of any event that the law recognized as an event. He found a camp that had been occupied for 8 days by 18 people, and that now contained, in its entirety, a stone fire ring, a timber game frame, a drainage ditch, and the frozen imprint of a group of boots at the clearing's northern edge. One set of which, he noted in his record, was smaller than the others and positioned slightly apart from the group, as if the person who had made them had paused there, at the edge of the pine stand, before going in. Small boots. A boy's boots. Standing at the threshold of the dark trees, paused, and then gone. Drummond was called to see the boot prints. He crouched over them in the cold light of the November morning and looked at them for a long time, and then he put out one hand and pressed it flat to the frozen ground beside the nearest impression. the way a person might touch the last physical evidence of something they need to acknowledge as real. He stood up. He turned to Sheriff Polk. "We're done here," he said. Polk looked at him. "Reverend, we're done here," Drummond said again, with the quiet finality of a man who has made a decision that cannot be argued with, not because he possesses authority over the others, but because he possesses knowledge they do not, and that knowledge has produced in him a certainty that argument cannot reach. "There is nothing here to find. There has been nothing here to find since we left. Whatever took those boys, it has finished what it came to do, and it does not need us to remain." Polk studied him. "You know what took them. I know what I believe took them. I don't have evidence that would satisfy your office or any court of law." "Tell me anyway." Drummond looked at the pine stand, at the dark interior of it, the low-branched tunnel of shadow where Jerome Aldis's bare feet had carried him in the middle of the night, at the clean stone by the creek where the marks had been, at the smooth ground where the bedrolls had lain without leaving an impression. "Something that has been here a very long time," he said. "Something that this mountain has always contained in this specific place, at this specific elevation. Something that waits for people to camp within its range and then takes them, not randomly, not violently, but with a patience and a method that suggests intention. That suggests selection." He paused. "The marks were a count. 17 marks for 17 people. As each person was taken, a mark was removed. The camp, the physical evidence of our presence, was erased after the last of us left, as if the event needed to be closed, completed, as if it had a structure." He turned back to Polk. "I don't have a name for what operates with that kind of structure in a Kentucky forest in 1883. I have Horace Alt's name for it, and I don't accept Horace Alt's theology, so I have no name." Polk wrote in his notebook for a moment. Then he closed it and looked at the clearing one last time and said the most pragmatic sentence available to a man in his position. "We go back. I'll write the report." They went back. The report, filed with the Harlan County Clerk's office on November 17, 1883, recorded 6 missing persons: Jerome Aldis, Horace Birch, Levi Tatum, Owen Marsh, Roy Dempsey, and Amos Lott, whose disappearances were attributed, in the carefully neutral language of official documentation, to unknown circumstances during a wilderness expedition in the ridge country northeast of Harlan. The report noted that the campsite had been found cleared of all expedition equipment and personal effects, and that no evidence of foul play, animal attack, or accidental death had been discovered. It recommended further investigation by parties better equipped for extended mountain search operations. No further investigation was conducted. No remains were ever found. Cold Pines was not visited again by any documented party for 11 years. Thomas Vane was 28 years old in the autumn of 1894, and in those 11 years he had become, in the orderly progression of a capable and serious-minded man, a journalist for the Harlan County Courier, a husband, a father of 2 daughters, and a person who did not sleep well in October and November. He had covered mine accidents and labor disputes, and the particular variety of human event that a coal country newspaper produces in reliable quantity. He had interviewed men who had seen terrible things and had learned in the process how to ask the questions that produced the specific quality of account he needed: precise, honest, structurally sound. He was good at his work. He was regarded by those who knew him professionally as a man of exceptional clarity and uncommon fairness. He had not written about Cold Pines, not once. Not in 11 years of journalism, not in the private correspondence he maintained with several of the other survivors, not in the journal he had kept with uninterrupted discipline since the expedition. He had the complete field record in a locked box in his study. The notebook from the expedition itself, the clean transcription he had made on November 12th, the individual accounts he had collected from the other scouts the following day. He had never shown it to anyone. He had never discussed the expedition in any forum more public than a quiet conversation with another survivor or, on 3 occasions, with his wife, who had listened with the particular stillness of a person absorbing something they know they cannot fully absorb and have decided to hold anyway for the sake of the person speaking. He had stayed away from Cold Pines because staying away was the correct decision, because nothing useful could come of return, because the 6 missing boys were gone in a way that made return not a search, but a gesture, and gestures of that kind, in his considered view, served the living more than the dead, and were therefore a form of selfishness dressed as tribute. He had stayed away, and he had been correct to stay away, and he knew that he was going back. He had known it since September of that year, when he received a letter from Moses Dritt. Moses was 26 and lived in Letcher County now, working as a surveyor, a natural progression for a boy who had always read the land with such precision. They corresponded irregularly, in the way of people who share a significant experience and feel, in the face of ordinary life, that the experience creates an obligation toward each other that is not fully expressible through the normal channels of friendship. Moses wrote briefly and factually, in keeping with his character, and his letters were always about observable things. The terrain he was surveying, the weather, the specific details of the physical world that he continued to read with the same absorbed attention he had brought to the forest at 14. The September letter was different. It was 3 paragraphs long, and the first 2 covered the work he was doing and the condition of the roads in Letcher County and the early arrival of cold weather, which he noted was similar to the pattern of 1883. The 3rd paragraph said this: "I have been back to the ridge above Cold Pines twice this autumn, on survey work for a timber company operating in that section. I did not go to the clearing, but I was close enough, on the 2nd visit, to see the pine stand from the ridge above. I want to tell you something, and I want you to understand that I am telling you as a fact, in the same way I would tell you the depth of a creek or the age of a tree, because I have been in the practice of reporting what I observe accurately and without embellishment, and I will not change that practice for this. The pine stand is different. It has grown, considerably, in a way that is not consistent with 11 years of normal growth for that species at that elevation. The trees are taller and denser than they should be, and the clearing, as best I could determine from the ridge, is smaller than it was. I believe it is being reclaimed. I believe whatever process operates in that place is ongoing. I thought you should know. I do not know what the correct response to this information is. I suspect you do." Vane read the letter 3 times, and then he put it in the locked box with the rest of the Cold Pines documentation. And then he took it out of the box again and read it one more time. And then he told his wife he would be gone for 3 days on a matter relating to work. And she looked at him with the steady eyes of a woman who has been married long enough to know when her husband is telling the truth and when he is telling a version of it. And she said, "Be careful, Thomas." And he said he would, and he went. He went alone because he had considered asking Moses and decided against it. Moses had done enough. Moses had been the first one to know and the last one to say so, and the person who had read the limestone marks with his surveyor's precision and counted 14 where there had been 17 and delivered that number to Vane in a flat, informational voice on a mountain trail without looking back. Moses had paid his dues to this place in full. Vane was not going to ask him to pay more. He traveled the first part of the route to Cold Pines in good order, moving with the deliberate pace of a man who is not rushing toward what awaits him and is not pretending that he is not frightened of it. He had thought carefully about what fear was appropriate in this situation and had concluded that all of it was appropriate, every measure of it, and that the correct management of it was not suppression but acknowledgement. The way you acknowledge a difficult terrain feature by looking directly at it and planning your route accordingly. He was frightened. He was going anyway. Those two facts existed comfortably together in him, the way two true things can coexist without cancelling each other. The forest received him with the normalized sounds of an October woodland. Wind in the upper canopy, the distant percussion of woodpeckers, the small adjustments of branches and leaf litter that constitute the ambient sound of a living place. He listened carefully as he descended toward Cold Pines, calibrating the sounds against the memory of the silence of 1883, and the forest remained normal until he was approximately 200 yards from the clearing's position. And then it stopped. Not gradually, not with the slow diminishment he had experienced on arrival 11 years ago. It stopped with the clean precision of a door closing, and the absorbed silence that replaced it was exactly as he remembered it. Complete, textured, present in the way that a silence that has intention is present differently from a silence that is merely the absence of sound. This silence was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something that converted sound to nothing before it could become itself. He kept walking. The white pine stand was exactly where Moses's letter had described it. Taller, denser, the lower branches interlocking closer to the ground than 11 years of normal growth would produce. The trees had the quality of very old things asserting their age, pressing their claim on the terrain around them with the slow, implacable authority of growth that does not hurry because it does not need to. Vane stood at the edge of the stand and looked into the low tunnel of shadow inside it, and breathed the cold air, and listened to the silence, and then walked through. The clearing was smaller. Moses had been correct about that. The pines had advanced from the north, reclaiming 6 or 8 feet of ground that had been open in 1883, and the clearing now had the compressed, enclosed quality of a room rather than the relative openness of the camp he remembered. The stone fire ring was there. The timber game frame was gone, rotted or reclaimed. The uprights that had once supported it reduced to 2 low stubs of grey wood, barely visible in the leaf litter. The drainage ditch was still faintly legible as a depression in the ground. The clearing was empty. Ordinary. The leaf litter was undisturbed. The ground was frozen in the manner of a Kentucky October at elevation and showed no impression of any recent presence. Vane stood in the center of the clearing and turned a slow circle, and then he went to the creek. The limestone bank was there, the flat shelf of gray stone along the water's edge, stained and pitted and old, running its 20 feet along the inner bank before dropping to the water. Vane crouched at the innermost edge of the shelf and looked at the ark. The marks were there. Not the original 17. Not the 14 that Moses had found on the morning of their departure. New marks, or rather the same marks, or the same kind of marks, renewed, present again in the soft algae surface of the stone, with the same clean regularity of spacing, the same vertical line intersected by 2 shorter horizontal lines, arranged in the same arc along the stone's inner edge. He counted them. 9. He sat on his heels over the 9 marks and counted them 3 times, and then sat down fully on the cold limestone and looked at the creek and let the information arrange itself in his mind with the patience of a man who has learned over 11 years not to rush the process by which difficult facts become comprehensible. 9 marks. They had entered with 17. 6 had been taken at Cold Pines and on the return trail. That left 11 survivors plus Drummond, 12 people who had walked out of the forest. And now, there were 9 marks, which meant that in the 11 years since the expedition, 3 more of the 12 had been marked here in the stone of this creek bank, in this clearing that no one had officially visited since the search party of November 1883. He opened his notebook and wrote the names of the 12 survivors, including Drummond, and then began the arithmetic of subtraction. He knew of 2 deaths in the intervening years. Daniel Priest had died in a mine collapse in 1887 at 19. Roy, he stopped. Roy Dempsey had vanished in the forest, not a survivor. he recounted. 11 survivors plus Drummond. 12. 3 marks subtracted from 12 left 9. He wrote names in his notebook and went through them with the systematic attention he brought to every accounting. And when he was done, he sat for a long time with the pencil resting on the page, looking at the 3 names he had circled. Fletcher Kane, who had stopped on the return trail and been the first to see that the forest had changed, had died in the winter of 1889. His family said he had walked into the woods behind his house one evening in December and not come back. His body was never found. He was 22. Gideon Waller, who had watched Owen Marsh disappear from 4 feet in front of him and described the sensation of a hand reaching for an empty shelf, had gone missing from his farm in Letcher County in the spring of 1891. He was 23. His wife reported that he had been sleeping poorly for months before he disappeared, and that he had developed a habit, in the weeks immediately preceding his disappearance, of standing at the window in the early morning hours, looking north. And Reverend Elias Drummond, who had hesitated at the gatepost on November 3rd, 1883, and walked into the mountains anyway, and brought 12 boys out of the forest by connecting them into a human chain and climbing through the dark toward open sky. Drummond had died in his study on a January night in 1892, seated at his desk with his journal open and his pen in his hand. The county physician said it was his heart. His housekeeper, who found him in the morning, said the room was cold because the fire had gone out, which was unusual because the Reverend always maintained his fire through the night, and that the journal on the desk was open to a blank page. Unusual because Drummond always completed his entries before sleeping. He had been writing something and had not finished it. The journal had been in the possession of Drummond's sister since his death. Vane had visited her in Lexington in the summer of 1892, and she had shown him the final entry, or rather the final attempted entry. The page with the pen mark where Drummond's hand had stopped, midway through the first line of what would have been an entry for January 14th, 1892, 9 years after the expedition. The pen mark was a single vertical line, just one. Vane had looked at that line for a long time in the sisters' parlor in Lexington in the summer of 1892, and he had understood what it meant, and he had not said so to Drummond's sister, because there are things that truth requires you to carry alone. He sat now on the limestone bank of Ravens Fork Creek at Cold Pines and looked at the 9 marks in the stone and understood their full arithmetic for the first time. Not 8 had been taken, not 6, as the official record stated. 9. The 6 who had disappeared during the expedition, and then Fletcher Kane, who had walked into the woods behind his house, and Gideon Waller, who had stood at his window looking north, and Reverend Elias Drummond, who had written a single vertical line and stopped. 9 marks, 9 taken, 9 remaining. And the 9 remaining, Moses and himself and Perry Aldis and August Finch and Caleb Rourke and Samuel Cray and Curtis Vane and Nathan Ford and Horace Birch, had survived not because they were braver or stronger or more capable than the 9 who were gone, but because whatever operated in this place had taken what it intended to take and left the rest, with the patience and the method and the structural intention that Drummond had described to poke on the clearing's edge, something that selects, something that counts. Vane looked at the 9 marks for a long time. Then he did something that he could not fully explain in the account he wrote afterward, that he described only as a response to impulse rather than reason, a thing the body does when the mind has run out of its available options. He reached out and pressed his hand flat to the stone beside the arc of marks, the way Drummond had pressed his hand to the frozen ground beside the boot prints 11 years before. The stone was cold, just limestone in October in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, doing what limestone does, which is to hold the cold and give it back to whatever touches it. Nothing else. No response, no acknowledgement, no sensation beyond the ordinary cold fact of old stone. He held his hand there anyway for a long moment, because the gesture was for the people whose names were in that stone, and gestures of that kind He had reconsidered, served the dead more than the living, and the dead were owed what could be given. Then he stood up and walked back through the clearing and through the pine stand, and the silence of the forest held around him until he was 200 yards north of the clearing. And then the sounds came back. Wind, woodpecker, branch and leaf. And he walked in those sounds all the way back to the trailhead and to his horse and to the road south toward Harlan. He wrote the complete account that winter. All of it, from the gate post to the limestone, from Pearl Aldis's two-armed wave to the single vertical line in Drummond's journal. He wrote it in the clean, precise narrative voice he had been developing since he was 17 years old, and had first understood that the act of writing was not the act of recording, but the act of making true, of imposing on the formless mass of experience a structure that allows it to be understood, not resolved, not explained, but held in language, carried without being crushed by. He titled it A Record of the Expedition to Cold Pines and Its Aftermath, 1883-1894, and he placed it in the locked box with the rest of the documentation and sealed the box with the specific intention of never opening it again, which he may